Hey folks, so it is Rocktober, or October, or whatever cool thing you want to call October. But yeah, here we are again, and I've had a pretty good month. There's been a lot of interesting stuff come out of the cinema, and maybe slightly less that I managed to see on home media and in streaming. I've had a pretty good month. So without anything further, let's just dive into the stuff that I've seen, and see what I can recommend, and what I can tell you to avoid. Okay, you remember the X-Men movies? Well, there's a couple of them I haven't actually seen, so I decided to change that. So I waded into X-Men Apocalypse, which is the second to last of the main series that they made. I mean, technically, Deadpool and Logan are also X-Men movies because they're in that universe, but shh, never mind. It's all about how back in Egypt times there was a big scary mutant called Apocalypse, but he got buried under a collapsed pyramid, and in the mid-80s he gets unearthed and goes on a big rampage to take over the world, you know, basic bad guy stuff as usual. And he enlists 4 mutants as a kind of personal honour guard, including young Storm, and also Magneto, who's having a bad day at this time. So, yeah, this film's a mess. I mean, this film is a total mess. To be honest, the X-Men movies are kind of 50-50 hit and miss, and for everyone that's really good like X-Men 2 or Logan or Days of Future Past, there's an X-Men 3 or a Wolverine Origins, so it's no surprise that this one turned out to be a horrible, ungodly mess of too many characters, too many plot lines, and frankly, it feels like it was probably a 4-hour movie cut down to 2 in a really bad edit job, so it was messy as hell. And there's not an awful lot that I can recommend here unless you're a completist, so yeah, I mean, after this, I'm not really in a big rush to watch Dark Phoenix, which is the final one that I've not seen, because I've heard it's actually the worst of the lot. In the case of X-Men Apocalypse, 2 out of 5, yeah, better off you just rewatch one of the 2 good Wolverine movies instead. And speaking of other completely unwatchable crap, this is a twofer, because the Spanish film Summertime lives in infamy, since it was so unwatchably bad that it was summarily cancelled 15 minutes in when it became clear that there's absolutely nothing redeeming about this camcorder-looking shot piece of pretentious nonsense about 2 bikini-clad paranormal detectives looking into a haunted house, when in fact all they kind of really do is sort of bum about moaning about how the job's boring, snorting coke and talking about weird stuff. And not even like the 5-minute own brand Elvira intro style sequence could save it, but yeah. So, turned it off, never watched the rest, absolute crap, 1 out of 5. This is garbage. So the film we ended up watching instead was Zombie Hunter, which is also kind of a badly shot, cheap film where a zombie apocalypse occurs and there's a kind of Tesco value Mad Max and he has to fight along with Chips and Beans Pamela Anderson and a weirdo brother and cute sister pair and a bunch of other randos, and they've got loads of zombies attacking them and some really bad CGI monsters and a very, very small amount of help from Danny Trejo, who's in the film for like 2 minutes as this sort of zombie killing priest guy. Yeah, he was all over the poster in the building but barely in the movie. And look, this is not a good film. I mean, it's slightly better than Summertime, so I'd give it 2 out of 5, but barely watchable, hardly even fun to laugh at. So yeah, 2 for 2, both were complete poo. Next up was a film called The Goldfinch, which is based on a book. Now, everybody likes a good literary adaptation, and Lord knows there's an awful lot of them. From the sublimely good ones like Lord of the Rings movies or Catch-22, and the bizarre and strange ones like Age of Dragons. But The Goldfinch is the kind of adaptation where the people making it apparently didn't really understand why the book works, because what they made was really just a really long, kind of boring story. It's all about the guy from Baby Driver, who's a furniture salesman, but he grew up in a bad lot when his mum died in a terrorist attack and he ended up stealing a painting, the titular Goldfinch, while he was concussed. But then he has a bunch of other adventures that make sense if you read the book, I imagine, but in the film, since we're missing whatever the subtext is supposed to be, it ends up just being a lot of him doing not an awful lot and things being depressing, and then the story jumping back and forward in time to show things being more depressing. So yeah, can't really recommend. I mean, despite, some really good actors in it, and it actually being shot quite well, 2 out of 5, and really, that kid from Stranger Things with the unfortunate nose, yeah, he really can't do a Russian accent, so Niet is very bad, do not do it. Do not. But here's one for the books. I actually went back to the movie Summertime again. Yep, you see, my internet was having a total mare one evening, and I'd still had it downloaded off of Prime onto my iPad from when I tried to watch it the previous time. And it turns out that almost immediately after the point where I turned it off, things started getting really weird. You see, the 2 bikini detectives start getting annoyed with themselves at how daft the situation is in the house, and more they start to break character until it becomes clear they're actors who know that they're actors who've been sent to a house to shoot a found footage horror movie, but they're actually now trapped inside the movie, and they keep getting confounded and troubled by cuts and things, and they start trying to find the script and change it, and okay, the story drags out far too long, and they get into all kinds of meta stuff, and then a random dude turns up, and there's a musical number at one point, and it just gets more and more nuts as the film goes on. The trouble is it also gets kind of boring. There's really maybe about 40 minutes at most of material here, and the film's 90 minutes long and was clearly shot for about £5. So despite all that, and me coming back to watch it, it's still only a 2 out of 5 film. But it gets at least that extra 1 point because it's not quite the 1 out of 5 garbage that I originally thought. So there you go, sometimes it's worth watching something to the end, and sometimes you're right just to turn it off in the first place. And in a fairly massive change of pace and tone, I also saw a film called Made in Dagenham. Now, Made in Dagenham's a film telling the fictionalised account of the very first women-led strike in a UK factory back in the 1960s, when the women at this Dagenham Ford factory stopped sewing patches and leatherwork on the car interiors until they were guaranteed something approaching the same kind of job security, respect and pay as the men working at the factory got. Now, this is a film in that classic British comedy drama social realism mould where a person or a bunch of people from the working class put up some kind of decent struggle of good-heartedness to win through on, or talent, and, to look after their families by sticking it to the man or proving they can do whatever it is that society says they can't do. I mean, you've seen this film before like 100 times and it's not like they haven't stopped making them. Anyway, Made in Dagenham feels like the most classic example of this, or put another way, it hits every single beat that you would expect and manages to land itself in every single tired and worn out trope that you would expect, right down almost to the second. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad, because it's not. It doesn't mean it just means it's not inventive, it's kind of paint by numbers, it's not that well written. But I mean, that aside, it still has a great cast of actors, including several Oscar winners and other lauded theatre and movie faces that you probably know. So I mean, it's not a bad film, it's just really mediocre, so 3 out of 5, that kind of thing. I'd actually recommend, if you really wanted to check this out, there is also a musical, which is apparently much better and more interesting, so yeah, that looks like that would be a bit more fun and a bit more of a giggle than this was. But what movies did I see at the pictures, you asked? Well, to begin with, I saw Venom, Let There Be Carnage. Now, this is the sequel to that Venom movie from a few years ago. Now, if you missed all that, Venom's basically, he's a space alien goo monster from the Spider-Man comics, and the character was actually in one of the old Spider-Man movies, but this is his own separate movie universe, where in it he lands on Eddie Brock, who's like a crap TV reporter, and turns him into a bit of a superhero, kind of. Anyway, in this new movie, Venom and Eddie are like a few years down the line and they're having kind of issues with each other, and through a series of misadventures, a serial killer ends up getting like some of the symbiote into his system and turns into an even bigger, scarier version. And this is all kinds of daft fun, and actually I quite enjoyed it. I mean, it could have done without them trying to needlessly tie it into the MCU towards the end, but I mean, that's sort of to be expected at this stage. Money's bigger than making a movie standalone these days. But still, yeah, it was entertaining. Woody Harrelson was good. Tom Hardy puts in a great performance, clearly having a bit of a giggle, and throwing himself around. And the whole thing was directed by Andy Serkis, the guy who did Gollum. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's brainless entertainment, but it's actually quite good fun, and probably better than the original. Another film I saw was The Last Duel. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of Ridley Scott, him who made Alien and Gladiator, and Ridley does like himself a bit of classic period drama, and has done ever since his early days, and more recently with his version of Robin Hood and Kingdom of Heaven. And he's gone right back to this era again with his latest film, which is based on the real-life true story of a pair of French squires who fall out a bunch of times over various things, and then one of them accuses the other one of raping his wife, leading to them having the last ever duel to the death in French history. And the thing is, this isn't even really the story of them, because at the heart of it, it's actually a story about a woman caught in the middle of a power struggle between two men living in this terrible patriarchal society. Now, I've not actually seen Julie Comer in that much. I mean, I know she was in Killing Eve, but I've never really seen much of that, and I saw her in Free Guy, where she wasn't really being asked to do an awful lot. But in this, she's absolutely phenomenal. In fact, everybody is absolutely phenomenal in this. I mean, you've got Matt Damon playing against type as this kind of meathead brawler sort of knight guy who thinks before he acts, and Adam Driver as this overeducated Lothario, and you've then got Ben Affleck as this kind of pompous drunk peacock of a duke who ends up stealing the show from everybody else in the movie every time he's on screen. And the great thing about this is it's actually the same story told multiple times, roughly 3 times, going over a lot of the same scenes with a slightly different spin depending on whose point of view it's being told from. So sort of like Rashomon, the famous Japanese film by Kurosawa, which tells like a similar sort of story from different people's point of view. But in each retelling it's subtly different. But in this case, it doesn't matter because all 3 roads eventually lead to this kind of hellish, brutal duel, the result of which is going to end up in the death of at least one of the characters, but also could end up in the death of the woman as well, because she gets burned at the stake if it's found out that she told a lie. Now, this is a 4 out of 5, but it's a really solid film. I mean, it only loses a little because, like pretty much all Ridley Scott movies, the first act is a little bit choppy, which makes me also assume that there's probably like a 3.5 hour director's cut going to come down the road on DVD eventually, because there usually is with his films, and when you see that, that usually irons out why the first act is a little bit messy. But still, if by any chance this is still out in a cinema near you, go see it. It's really, really fantastic, it's beautifully shot, and it's actually a really well acted and really well told story that's got a lot of social relevance at the moment. Now, a film that's been delayed probably more than any other through the whole of lockdown was No Time to Die, which is the 25th James Bond film, and also the 5th and final film to star Daniel Craig as the classic super spy 007. And it's been a bit of a rollercoaster through his movies, from the Bourne-esque prequelish reboot of Casino Royale through the bumps of Quantum Solace and Spectre, with the high point of Skyfall in the middle. So how does it all end? Well, in a pretty solid way for Craig to bow out. I mean, it's not the best film, but it's far from the worst as well. And the story picks up where Spectre, the previous film, left off, with Bond and Madeleine away honeymooning in Italy when he gets attacked by bad guys, and the bad guys name drop her, making him immediately suspect her of badness, because he's obviously thick. So he believes them and ditches her, only to get dragged into a generic supervillain plot later on that tangentially involves her and the fate of the world, and cue the usual globe-trotting shooting spy stuff. With slightly less snooky than you would normally get, but that makes sense in this story. But the upshot is the action's solid, there's some really good laughs here, but the downside is there's probably too many laughs, and the writing of the comedy sounds exactly like it was written by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, which makes sense because she worked on the script. So yeah, you get an awful lot of stuff that sounds very much like Fleabag or Killing Eve, and that does pull you a little bit out of the Bondishness of it because it feels slightly different from what you used to and what you'd expect. But no, I'd say solid 3 out of 5. Some people might go higher, but I suppose it depends how big a Bond fan you are. But for me, it was just middle of the road. Okay, so Dune. Yeah, I saw Dune. Dune, not June, the month. Dune, which is a movie based on an old classic sci-fi epic. So if you think of Lord of the Rings as being like the big granddaddy book of fantasy epic stories, then Dune is basically the same book for science fiction. And it's actually been done as a film before in the early 80s. They tried to cash in on the Star Wars and Alien crazes by shooting a really weird and bonkers one, designed by H.R. Geiger, the guy who made the Xenomorph and the Alien movies, and filmed by Twin Peaks director David Lynch with a huge budget. And it was completely bonkers, very weird, looks really bizarre, and it kind of has a bit of a cult following it, but is generally remembered as being a bit meh.
What a heavy load Einstein must have had. Fucking morons everywhere.
And later on, the Sci-Fi Channel actually did a halfway decent TV version of this about 20 years ago, which is horribly hampered by having very little budget, but it's actually pretty watchable, and it makes a lot more sense than the David Lynch film, having a far longer runtime of about 4 hours rather than 2. Anyway, Dune, the new one, is directed by the amazing French director Denis Villeneuve. He's the same guy that was behind the amazing sci-fi mindbender movie Arrival, which is really great and I love, and the edgy CIA versus the cartels thriller movie Sicario, and then also the very recent late sequel Blade Runner 2049, each of which showcases that he's a guy who manages to do big themes, good emotional acting, fantastic action, and really tense and thrilling scenes, and also amazing epic cinema that looks, sounds and feels incredible. So yeah, I'm a bit of a fan. So what did he do with Dune? He only went and made it about the most staggeringly beautiful, sumptuous and amazing looking desert movie probably since Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, taking the story and themes of the book and weaving them into a narrowly focused tale of warring houses across the galaxy. I mean, I think this is basically like Game of Thrones but in space. I mean, actually, there's an awful lot of similarity between the first book of Game of Thrones if you stop and think about this. But the basic story is the Atreides family, headed by cool dad Duke Leto and his concubine the magic space nun Lady Jessica, and their son Paul, they've been gifted control of the planet Arrakis, aka Dune, by the Space Emperor so that they can farm up all the spice, which is basically like magic MacGuffin dust that does everything important in this universe, from space travel to making you psychic to all kinds of things. Trouble is, it also means the nasty bad family, the Harkonnens, who used to own Dune, they got kicked out and now they're plotting revenge. And there's a whole bunch of intrigue and double-crossing in the wind, and meanwhile Paul and the rest of the fam get to know the planet, and the Fremen, who are like these sort of nomadic people who live there, who don't really like anyone else because everyone else is basically colonising them. And it's a kind of huge, sweeping, beautiful film that, as I said, is a little bit Lawrence of Arabia, a little bit Star Wars, a bit Game of Thrones, and I absolutely loved it. 5 out of 5 here. If there's a problem with this movie, it's that this is actually only about half the book, and it stops kind of abruptly at the story's midpoint with a kind of a bit of a wink to camera and a sort of sense that really what they're just saying to you is, we'll tell you the rest of the story if we get a sequel.
This is only the beginning.
And luckily enough, Warner Brothers have just announced that yes, they are going to greenlight the sequel, so we should expect more Dune in about 18 months' time. Yay! Because, I mean, let's face it, there's 8 more books in the series, so they could just keep churning these out for the next 10 years if it's as good as the first one. So anyway, I can't recommend it enough, but I would say see it in the cinema, see it in IMAX if you can, or just the biggest cinema screen you can get to. I mean, I know it is out on HBO Max in America, but honestly, it's not worth watching this on a telly. This is a film made to be seen on a gigantic screen with a great sound system, so even if you have a massive TV, it probably won't do it the full justice. But yeah, absolutely has been worth the wait through the last year of madness. So yeah, think of this as just a wee treat to go back to the cinema and enjoy something that genuinely is all about the theatrical experience and well worth your time. So yeah, that was my October. So as I said, there's a lot of big films there. I mean, you had stuff like James Bond and Dune, which have been stuff that's been long awaited. Newer things like The Last Duel, which sadly apparently isn't doing too well in the cinema, but there you go, it's maybe not something that's everybody's cup of tea. But yeah, I've had a pretty good one, and there's a lot of interesting stuff on the horizon. I mean, we've got our next MCU film, like The Eternals, coming out next month, and a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, I hope people have been enjoying themselves and having a good time. Feel free to drop in the comments if there's anything you've been seeing recently, because, you know, there's no reason not to just drop a wee thing and say hello. I've also been watching a little bit of Squid Game, not much, and I managed to watch my way through Season 2 of Another Life, which was terrible, so I wouldn't even bother watching that. I'm not even going to make a video about how bad it was. It's just bad. But yeah, till next time, these have been my grumpy opinions. And a special thanks to all my patrons, and most especially my top tier patrons, Judith Coloma, Laurie Laporte, and Michelle Forbes. Thanks guys, everyone keep it real, keep safe, and take care of yourselves. Bye bye.